I'm Dr. Paul Jenkins, a professional psychologist. You know when you see therapy scenes in the movies or on TV, have you ever wondered just how accurate that is or what a psychologist would think about it? Let's take a look at a few clips together and I'll let you know what I think. Way back in 1991, a movie came out called What About Bob, starring Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. And this movie really got the attention of the psychological community. I remember I was still in graduate school studying to become a psychologist, but I had already had experiences with patients like Bob. And so it's pretty funny. But there's a therapy scene there I want to take a look at with you. Let's take a look.
Dr. Marvin, Bob Wiley.
Thank you. Thank you for working me in. Hello.
Right there, the hanky. Well, first of all, before I comment about that, this setup is a little weird to me. I know a lot of psychologists, I know a lot of psychiatrists. This scene is being handled kind of like a corporate go in to see the president of the company, where the receptionist or the secretary comes in, introduces the person to the professional. In most professional settings that I know, there's a waiting room, there's an area where people gather, they might interact with the front office staff, they might be invited to take a seat, and typically the professional, him or herself, comes out to greet their client or patient and invite them into the office. That's the way it usually works. Now, I suppose there could be professionals in the field who have a little more formal arrangement and someone brings them in and introduces them. That just struck me as a little weird. But then when Bob reaches out to shake hands with the doctor and he has a handkerchief in his hand, the thing that struck me the most about that is that it's all too true. We're filming this episode in 2020, and as you know, during a global pandemic, people become more sensitive to contact. We probably wouldn't even shake hands during a pandemic, but he wanted to create a barrier here for his own safety, probably because of his anxieties, probably about germs or spreading illness or disease. Let's see how this plays out.
Should I call you Dr. Marvin or Leo?
Whichever you like.
Call me Bob.
One of the interesting things about this scene to me is that Bob is kind of driving it, and this is part of the theme of the movie, that he hijacks or takes over the entire process and he's driving the whole time. Here's this very formal therapist, Dr. Marvin, who doesn't initiate the contact. That's the first thing that I noticed as I was watching this particular therapy scene. He's not giving him any structure or guidance. He's simply rolling with whatever's happening. And that seems a little weird to me. Also, when Bob asked, "What shall I call you?" he didn't give him any direction there. He's okay with this patient calling him by his first name. That's just a little weird given the formality of this particular therapeutic setting.
Call me Bob.
Bob?
Is that your family?
Yes.
Oh, wait, let me guess. I'm very good at this. That's Harriet, and then Ronnie, Gretchen, and Rita.
This is a little weird. First of all, if he got it right, that would be kind of creepy and probably a big red flag. I remember when I was being trained as a psychologist that we had a lot of discussion about appropriate boundaries, therapeutic boundaries, and maintaining an appropriate professional relationship with our clients. For a first-time meeting with a client, if they were to come into the room and get those names right, that would be a little creepy because it would indicate there's been some stalking going on. Now, as this plays out, we're going to see that he didn't get it right. And that's what makes it kind of a funny scene, but let's see how it plays out.
Wait a second. Cecilia, Dorothy, and this is Kenneth and Bambi.
This is my son Sigmund and my wife Faye and my daughter Anna. And that's my sister Lily.
Now, there's a lot of things that are funny to me about this. First of all, Bob is guessing. He has no idea who these people are. He's guessing, he gets it wrong. But it's interesting what the therapist's response is. This doctor, played by Richard Dreyfuss, has a very flat affect. You don't see any enthusiasm or emotion from him at all, as he simply tells Bob what the names of his children are. The reason this is funny to a psychologist is because he has named his children Sigmund and Anna. If you're not sure of the significance of that, go look up the Freud family and you'll see why. He's obviously a very Freudian therapist. Now, that may not mean anything to most people. A typical Freudian psychoanalyst would not openly share the names of his family with a new patient. That would violate some of the doctor-patient boundaries that are pretty typical in that kind of therapy. So there's a little bit of irony here, as an obviously Freudian therapist is violating some of the tenets of that particular school of thought. Just kind of a weird start to the whole session in a lot of ways. Let's see if things get any better as they get into it. All right, already. Here's this therapist who simply sits back and he waits. I know that different therapists have different approaches, but this doesn't even seem fair to me, given what this therapist already knows about this particular client. He knows that he's got some issues. He knows that he's got some anxieties. He greeted him with a handkerchief, for example. So he knows that, but he's not offering any kind of guidance or support to even get the session started. That's just a little weird to me. It could be that this therapist is doing this diagnostically to try to figure out, okay, what's going on with this client? What direction is he going to take it? He's going to find out where this client is going to take it, but not establishing some kind of a therapeutic rapport or direction or boundaries around how this is going to work, I think is a recipe for some of the difficulties that this particular therapist encounters as the movie goes on. But let's see how the session proceeds.
Why don't I start? Huh?
And there you go. Bob says, why don't I start? He's like, okay, this guy's not going to do anything. I guess it's all up to me. And he's more than willing to do that because of who he is. I just thought that was kind of a weird way to start a session.
The simplest way to put it, I have problems. I worry about diseases, so I have trouble touching things. In public places, it's almost impossible.
When this movie was shot in 1991, what Bob is describing here as being afraid of diseases and going places and touching things might have been an indicator of a higher level of pathology. I think because of some of the things that have played out in our world as we have experienced outbreaks, pandemics, viruses, this is probably becoming more general instead of more specific. In other words, there's a lot of people that are concerned about that. Unfortunately, it's becoming a more regular part of life instead of an indicator of pathology. But in the movie, it's trying to set Bob up as this paranoid person. I'm a little concerned about how our society is probably going that direction as well. It's becoming more normal.
I have a real big problem moving.
Talk about moving.
The response there, talk about moving. This is really the first therapeutic type thing that is said by the doctor in this particular clip. This is a stereotypical phrase that a therapist sometimes uses. Talk about moving. It's therapist speak for, help me to understand what you just meant but when you said moving. And it's funny because it's stereotypical. Talk about whatever it is.
As long as I'm in my apartment, I'm okay. But when I want to go out, I get weird. Talk about weird. Talk about weird.
Talk about weird. Therapist is picking up on these key words that Bob is saying and inviting him to go more into it. This is actually a pretty good therapeutic technique when someone is sharing their story. Talk about that. Tell me more about that. It's funny because it's stereotypical, but it's actually something that you're going to encounter in a therapeutic setting as the therapist tries not to impose too much of their own thinking at this point, but they're still trying to draw out from the client what's going on for them.
Well, I get dizzy spells, nausea, cold sweats, hot sweats, fever blisters, difficulty breathing, difficulty swallowing, blurred vision, involuntary trembling, dead hands, numb lips, fingernail sensitivity, pelvic discomfort.
Fingernail sensitivity? That's funny. What's funny about this too is that he's finding every symptom he can possibly imagine and just throwing it out there. It's like, here's what's going on with me, doc. Can you figure this out? Meanwhile, the therapist is over there just kind of taking it all in. I wonder what he's thinking. This particular therapist, it's kind of an interesting portrayal of a therapist because he is very distant, very removed from the whole interaction. Well, he's even got a desk between him and his client. You know, that's something that I noticed earlier in the clip, and I hadn't even commented about it. It's interesting to have a therapeutic setting where the therapist has this big barrier between him or her and the client. Most of the psychotherapists that I know and that I hang out with and that I relate to remove the barriers. They get out in a chair where they can talk face to face without a barrier in between them. It's really more of a connection rather than an aloof, kind of distant, separated relationship like what we're seeing here in this particular setting. And now, as Bob is sharing all of these symptoms, it just has me wondering, okay, what is the therapist thinking? Let's see how it plays out.
Pelvic discomfort.
So the real question is, what is the crisis, Bob? What is it that you are truly afraid of?
Okay, there it is. So the therapist now reveals to us what his thinking is. So the real question is, Bob, what is the crisis? What is it that you are truly afraid of? This reveals to me that he had this agenda going on already in his mind. The therapist is thinking about, okay, he's afraid of something. Let's see what it is that he's afraid of. And he's been withholding sharing that until this point in the conversation. And it suggests to me, I'm not even sure he was completely listening to Bob at this point. He's just waiting for the time to insert his opinion or his own agenda about what's going on. That may be a little unfair. Of course, it's a theatrical depiction of a therapy setting. As I compared to a real therapy setting, it feels again like the therapist is very separate from the client here, not really connecting to where Bob's coming from, just looking for a chance to pursue his own agenda.
My heart stops beating. What if I'm looking for a bathroom, I can't find it, and my bladder explodes?
Let's stop there, because Bob just captured what I think is at the core of every fear. And remember, the doctor is asking him, what are you really afraid of? And Bob starts asking, what if questions? What if this? What if that? What if my heart stops? What if my bladder explodes? What if? See, at the heart of every fear is a what if question. And even though I see a lot of kind of incompetent things that are demonstrated on the therapist's part here, he did get to the point where he was able to ask Bob, okay, what are you really afraid of? And Bob goes right to the core of it by asking the what if questions. I think every fear is driven by the what if questions. And not only the question, but the subconscious answer to that question, which is, I can't handle that. That's what paralyzes us. That's what gets us stuck in our fears. That's what has Bob feeling like he's stuck and he's reaching out to this doctor in the first place. All of these what if questions. As this movie continues, if you've seen it, you know that the therapist gets to be stalked by Bob through the whole movie. And this is what makes it funny to us who are in the industry, because we've all had that client that's just a little too needy, a little too desperate to get our attention or to spend time with us. And he resorts to some very questionable therapeutic techniques later in the show as he tries to get rid of Bob. And that's part of the humor of the show. But I thought this particular segment where we look at the therapy session was illustrative in a lot of ways. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you've seen this movie and there's other parts that you'd like me to take a look at or respond to or react to, I'd be happy to do that. Go down to the comments and leave me a message about which part you'd really like to see me analyze or take a look at. I'd be happy to do that. It's kind of fun to take a look at major media productions and see how it relates to real life. Go to the Psychologist Reacts playlist here on the channel and you'll see how I've reacted to other shows or programs that you might be familiar with.
I saw her standing in the street alone. Her head was down, face locked onto her phone.